Hey folks, I would like to continue. This lesson is pretty short in terms of content, but it's adding even more content to what you already have. So try to remember strategies for remembering content. Practice is key, and having different ways of representing material, making a table, making some sort of chart, making a picture. I'm going to show you some pictures here. In this lesson, it's really just like a subcategory of the first lesson where I talk to you about how there are neurons. They're the functional and structural unit of your nervous system. We're going to just zoom in and look at what does a neuron look like and what are the parts that it has. So this first one talks about structures that are common to all neurons. So on the right is a pretty standard looking diagram of what a neuron looks like. If you're drawing it, it kind of looks like a tree, and I mentioned that before. The top part has spindly, branchy looking things. Then there's the skinny part that you could compare to the trunk of the tree and the roots at the bottom. Now, because I'm using a Google slide here, it didn't transfer my little numbers. But the first structure that we'll take a look at, and I'm just going to point because I'm scared to write with this smartboard, are the dendrites, and they are the spindly little branch things. Those are dendrites. It would be very realistic for me to show you a picture of a neuron like this one and ask you to identify where the dendrites are. So the dendrites are the short branched endings which receive, and if I felt confident in the smartboard, I would underline the word receive. One of the things that's really important in your nervous system is the direction of information. Information flows in a one-way pattern through a neuron. Of course, it can go in different directions overall in your nervous system, but through an individual neuron, it is a one-way path. It's a one-way street. So these branched endings here receive nerve impulses from other neurons or from sensory receptors and relay them to the next structure, which is the cell body. So information is coming in this way. Now, what exactly are they receiving? Well, when we zoom in on the connection between two neurons, which is a synapse, we'll talk about how there are neurotransmitters that go from one neuron to the next. So those are dendrites. The second part is the big sort of, I would say, sun-shaped structure in the middle. So it's what the dendrites are attached to. It's the cell body, or soma, and you'll remember from previous lessons that soma means body. So that's the cell body, or the soma, and you'll recognize it because that's where the nucleus is. So that dark circle in the middle is supposed to represent the nucleus. It also performs metabolic reactions. Now that's the general term for like all of these reactions that a cell would need to do to sustain life. And so you'll see little structures there. Those can represent, those little triangles could represent like enzymes and stuff like that. It processes the data received from the dendrites. So the dendrites receive information either from another neuron or maybe a sensory receptor. And the cell body processes it. Kind of like how the central nervous system makes a decision about the information it receives from sensory neurons. The cell body takes the information from all of the dendrites, right? They're all getting information from different places, and it processes it. And if the size of the depolarization, boy, that's a word that you might not have expected to see here. Polarizing, depolarizing are terms that have to do, you'll see, with positive and negative charges. Maybe if you were in physics, this is a term that you've used in other contexts before. Maybe we talked about the poles of a magnet. There's a positive and negative end. We're talking about electrical current flow. Kind of the same idea here. But again, that will get explained. The idea is if what's coming into the dendrites is enough, the cell body is going to say, okay, that was a big enough signal. I'm going to send this on to the next part of the neuron. It will relay it to the axon, which is the next part, and we'll have an influx of ions and other things will happen. we're going to talk really, really specifically about that part, which ions, which positively and negatively charged particles are coming in and out of the cell, when is it happening, where is it happening. The axon is this skinny thing that runs from the cell body all the way down to the bottom. It's covered with something in this picture, and that's only because I had a really hard time finding a picture of a neuron that didn't have the covering. So this skinny little line down the middle, that's the axon. These little rounded rectangles that look like they're covering it, they are not common to all neurons, but every picture on diploma exams that I could find in the history of time all had that on it. So it routes or directs the impulses from the cell body. So one-way flow. Information comes in through the dendrites, cell body processes it, sends it down the axon. So the information is going from the cell body down towards the bottom of the picture. This axon could be as long as a meter. You have some really long neurons in your body. They're not all that long. Some are very short, some are very long. And at the very bottom of the picture, you have these axon terminals. So where the axon starts branching off and you see these little almost ball-shaped structures at the ends, those are the axon terminals. Those are the parts that are going to communicate with other neurons, maybe a gland, maybe a muscle. The terminal releases little chemicals, those will be the neurotransmitters, and forms synapses, connections with other neurons. So those four parts, the dendrites, the cell body, the axon, and the axon terminal, all neurons have those. And they work in essentially the same manner all the time. Now before I go to the next slide that has some parts that are not common to all neurons, would anyone like to ask any questions so far? Yeah.
Sorry, could you point out the axon terminal?
Sure, I could. So see how at the end of these branches, it almost looks like there's a little round ball there? That's the axon terminal. Okay, so we have dendrites, they're like the branches of the tree. The cell body, which is like the full middle part of the tree. The axon, just like the trunk of the tree. And the axon terminals, which are like the roots of the tree. You might have to draw one of these, like I'm going to ask you on one of the future assignments to draw a little bit, but very probably, actually no, 100% probability that you're going to have to look at a picture of a neuron and identify structures. Probably you'll have to relate structures to their functions as well, so the question wouldn't just be where are the dendrites, but maybe identify the structure that receives information from other neurons. Or it might even be a question in context like, hey, there's a disorder where a person's neurons don't receive signals. Which part is affected? I just made that up on the fly. But that's the kind of stuff you would have to do with the diagram of the neuron. Anybody else want to ask anything here?
So the dendrites are like little...
Yeah, the dendrites are what look like the creepy Halloween branches, leafless branches at the top of the picture. Anybody else need to ask anything here? So here are the parts that some neurons have. Now if you remember, I said on the last picture there was something covering up the axon, but that I wasn't talking about it yet because not all neurons have that. It's called a myelin sheath. It is a lipid insulating layer. Now, hopefully you remember what a lipid is from Biology 20. Or Science 10. Your cells have a phospholipid bilayer. So, lipid insulating layer, and it gives a white appearance. So, I always remind people, I know it's hard if you're a vegetarian and you don't eat meat, but anytime you have a piece of meat and there's some fat on it, it looks white. So, that's how you can remember that this looks white. It's important that it's white. Okay? I wouldn't point that out and make such a big deal if it wasn't important. but neurons that have a myelin sheath look white, and sometimes that's how we'll distinguish them from neurons that don't have a myelin sheath. It protects neurons, and it also helps to accelerate nerve transmission. It makes it faster. So how does this work? Well, this green looking cell here is called a Schwann cell. And if you see, these little extensions from the Schwann cell have essentially wrapped themselves around the axon. So I chose this picture because it was a little more zoomed in. You can see the axon in the middle here, and then this green layer wrapped around it. So these extensions of the Schwann cells will wrap themselves around the axon. Notice that there's a space, okay? We're not covering the entire axon, just sections of it. And so when we're talking about an axon, we could call it myelinated or white matter if it has a myelin sheath. The opposite would be unmyelinated or gray matter. I know gray is not necessarily the opposite of white, but that's the color that we're giving to things. The CNS, so central nervous system, contains both types. Some of the neurons in your central nervous system are white or myelinated. Some of the neurons in your central nervous system are gray or unmyelinated. For the most part, the PNS, peripheral nervous system, so the nerves that extend from your spinal cord out to your body or that are coming from sensory receptors back in, they should mostly be myelinated, okay? Now I said before that there was a space. This little gap right here where you can see there's a myelin sheath, then there's a space where the axon's uncovered, then there's more myelin sheath, is called a node of Ranvier, or you can say Ranvier or whatever. It's a French word, so I said it the French way. But that's the space between Schwann cells. This is where nerve transmission actually happens. So nerve transmission requires things to come in and out of the axon. Charged particles, that's why I use the word polarization on the last slide. With that wrapping around it, nothing can get in or out. There's no way ions are getting through that lipid layer. So on these little gaps, these little nodes, that is where nerve transmission actually occurs. It skips over the myelinated parts. The result is that myelinated neurons will transmit information up to 50 times faster than an unmyelinated neuron. Now the last thing that's present in some neurons is if they're myelinated, they will have this membrane called neurolemma on the outside. So it'll be like an outer layer here. It promotes regeneration of damaged myelinated neurons. There's quite a bit of research into regenerating neurons or nerves that have been damaged, and it's not perfect, but quite a bit of research in this area, especially for neurons in the central nervous system, because we haven't really gotten very far with that yet. Now, if you have the notes printed, there's a table that follows that we'll use as review the next time, so I'm not going to look at it right at this moment in time. It summarizes the difference between gray and white matter, so myelinated and unmyelinated neurons. But like I said, we'll look at it the next time as some review.